Hello everyone, welcome to NQA's webinar on utilising your management system to return to work safely. My name's Terry Fisher. I hope you're all sitting comfortably. So what we'll do throughout the webinar, we'll go through an introduction, what we're trying to achieve by the webinar, various things. Please feel free to ask questions as we go through, although there will be a question and answer session at the end to summarise various things. Just to clarify, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to the registered attendees for the future, and it will be available online within a few days of the broadcast, etc. So, right then. So as soon as it's just after 11 o'clock, we'll make a start. For information, the webinar should take about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm Terry Fisher. I'm the Principal Assessor at NQA for Occupational Health and Safety. If you've got any questions as we go, you can put them in the chat box or the question box. And as I've said, the webinar will be recorded and the presentation will be sent out to those registered, presentation slides, etc. for future reference. So just bear in mind when you're asking questions, I won't be able to answer individual company related questions or specific questions related to a particular company. I can only answer generic questions, but we can open that out into a discussion if we've got time at the question and answer session at the end. So just a quick overview. Who are NQA, the purpose of the webinar, the structural changes required to your management system, and the process changes that we think you will be planning for safely returning to work during the COVID pandemic. And I'll touch on at the end COVID secure guideline verification, a recently introduced product that NQA has made available to clients. So as far as NQA is concerned, we're #1 in America for aerospace sector certification. We're in the top 3 in the UK and Ireland. We're China's #1 certification body for the automotive sector. We're 2nd in the UK and Ireland for aerospace, and we're 3rd globally for aerospace for that sector. And we're also #1 globally for telecommunications. So just a quick overview about the global nature of certification and NQA's presence in that. As part of our offering, we include all-inclusive fees. So there's for clients within the UK, there's no additional charges for travel or expenses. And that's the end of the sales pitch in terms of NQA, and we'll look at the purpose of this webinar today. So businesses have changed. I think every business, I don't think there's any business that hasn't been impacted in some way, shape or form by the current pandemic situation, COVID-19. It's impacted businesses in various ways, and a lot of businesses have had to reassess to ensure survival and ensure that organisations can continue operating and/or operating in a changed fashion with the current restrictions, etc. As organisations plan to start the work, they'll be reviewing certain items, and the management system is there so it can assist in future changes and changes. You need to use the management system as a tool to assist what you've got to do A lot of these things can be, certainly in smaller organisations, can be done quite informally, but it's important to use the system and the steps within the system to give you a logical outcome to what you're doing, rather than trying to do everything and be erratic in how you approach things. The management system that is there to help give you structure and help you plan and set priorities. The webinar itself is designed to highlight some of the changes you may need to take within the management systems so it can support you in the fundamental business change. Obviously looking at a safe return to work for staff and customers, because it isn't just about the workers per se, it's about the overall impact on society. We've broken the changes down and grouped them together as relevant into the relevant ISO sections, so it should be quite straightforward as we go through. And like I say, if you have any questions, by all means, put them in the questions box or the chat box, and we'll answer them as we go. So the ISO standards are already an established, logical, methodical way, and they're well mature and proven delivery within industry and in all sorts of sectors. So they are globally recognized for already giving that logical management system and a progressive way that is flexible. Don't perceive the management system as being rigid. It's about, it can change, it can be flexible. It's about meeting the need and the requirements of the organization. So the good news is that an ISO management system should already have the processes in place to handle any changes, etc., that's needed. So the process steps is what we're looking at in terms of that. If we just review the basics within the context of the organization, we're looking at, you should be asking the questions, what are the issues? What's changed for your organization? What restrictions apply, etc.? What does the organization need to achieve and want to achieve? Who are the interested parties? And should there be any changes to the scope of the management system? Some organizations may have changed their product offering because of COVID-19. They may have changed the strategic direction of the business because of COVID-19. So it's looking at the scope of the management system and ensuring that the management system is helping you deliver what you need and what is appropriate for your organization. Top management are still accountable for the effectiveness of the management system. They must ensure that the required changes are made to the management system. The management system should be incorporated into the daily and routine running of the processes, and it should be there supporting those activities. It's not about, oh, well, we make these or we do that service and we've got this ISO management system on the side. It should be there integrated in that. It should be developed and supporting all the things that you need to do. The resources required will need to be deployed and managed effectively, and the roles and responsibilities for completing all the various tasks and activities should be clearly assigned and communicated. Very important in terms of change is the communication elements with staff and with workers and service providers such as deliveries and you know, suppliers and that type of thing. Very important to have open communications. The structural changes within the system, risks and opportunities faced by the management system and the organisation may need reviewing. In fact, I would say they will always need reviewing in terms of COVID-19. Certainly within the UK, there's a requirement for you to make declarations, etc., in terms of what you've done, in terms of the new risks and potentially the new opportunities that are identified for organisations in the current situation. Actions to mitigate risk and realise opportunities should be prioritised and deployed. Organisational objectives may need realignment or completely re-establishing because of the new objectives or the new structural direction, strategic direction of the organisation. When all the planning has been achieved, then it's about implementing the changes, and you can then start looking at managing resources in order to prepare the organisation for returning to work. So you need to know what you're returning. Is it going to be, complete, or whatever needs to be what you're trying to do by returning to work, other than just keep the business operational. So what elements are going to be kept operational, etc. Looking at the allocation of necessary resources, ensure that you have the required people, infrastructure and environment in place to return to work safely. Like I say, is that everybody all at once? Is it phased return? There's a lot of things to consider in these demanding and changing times, and it appears that guidance changes quite frequently. So it's an ever-changing model to some extent, depending on your organisation and what services and what provision you do. Some businesses have been affected far more than others. Some sectors have been affected far more than others. Ensuring that people have all the knowledge, awareness and competence they need to return to work. So it may involve certainly involve some communication as to what the expectations are, what their fears and anxieties are in potentially returning to work, and ensuring the channels of communication are effective and documented and supported where appropriate within the system. Within Section 8, the operation, with all the above, once you've communicated what you intend to do, then it's about putting it into operation. And it's about ensuring that your health and safety and other management systems are managed effectively and deliver the benefit that you intend them to. This is a very dynamic situation in terms of it changes come frequently, and it can change to some extent week by week, or it sometimes feels almost daily that the demands and requirements are changing. There's also been issues with clarity of communication. At the end of the day, you need to use the information that's available to you and make decisions based on that information and the best people to understand your organisation. So you're well placed to think, well, you know your organisation best. Read the guidance and from the various sources, government guidance, trade associations, sector-specific industry associations. Use that to best effect to make the best decisions you can, and keep an eye on the changes for guidance. It's really important because, like I say, it's a very fluid situation at the moment. Things are changing quite rapidly. We also need to look at performance evaluation and monitoring and measurement performance as needed. We can't specify what that is. It all depends on individual organisations in the various sectors. There may be things that need to change in terms of your performance monitoring, maybe driven by your client base, maybe driven by your customers, maybe driven by your suppliers. Things have changed within the various elements of that, and you need to check how things are working in line with any changes that you've introduced, and making sure that you're actually achieving what you want to achieve is the key element there. So use your management review to monitor the change process and take any actions necessary to keep everyone safe and make improvements as you go, as things develop, as your experience grows and the maturity of experience increases, then make the changes as you go. It's about really being flexible and delivering that need. Throughout the webinar, in the various slides, we've tried to identify various elements. So looking at the black elements, the typed in black will be general, applicable to all types of management system. Red will relate specifically to health and safety, but could influence other elements of the management system. Green will relate to environment and energy, and blue will specifically relate to quality. So there's a mixed bag there, and we've tried to colour code it to make it easier for people to identify the relevant bits according to them. So if we first look at the context of the organisation, have all the internal and external issues been identified that are going to impact on the business and that have changed for the business, sort of pre-COVID? and what you need to do and why you need to do it going forward. There's no doubt going to be new issues that you need to consider. There may well be changes in interested parties, or the interested parties themselves haven't changed, but their requirements against your organisation and their expectations against your organisation has changed, such as customers, for example. You know, if you run a retail outlet, those requirements have definitely changed and have been quite fluid over the last few months in terms of where we were, the supermarkets, for example, to where we are in retail sector now generally. So things have changed quite significantly over a few months' time. So you've also got to keep an eye on the flexibility of the requirements and the changing needs. Have you completed and identified what you want and what you need and what your expectations are of the interested parties? Look at that. And it works both ways, what the interested party needs from you and expects from you and what you expect from them. So it's about this relationship. It's about working together for a common goal. Consider completing and revitalizing your SWOT and PESTEL analysis if you've used those, and update them accordingly. Like, it's quite a useful checklist to go through, a systematic process of evaluation for those. And it can be quite, because they've got so many variances, so many changes, it's quite useful to have a systematic approach to this thing rather than being overloaded with too many things to do in too short a time. So the better we are at planning and systematic approach to these things, the easier it should become to implement improvements and changes over time. Is there any changes to the scope of the management system? A lot of organisations have developed the services and completely changed the service provision that they once gave. As an example, distillers have gone from making alcoholic beverages. Some of them have changed from make hand sanitizer and various things. So they've changed the marketplace in response to COVID-19 and because of a commercial need and requirement within the marketplace and for them to maintain operations. So that's just one example of, you may need to look at the scope of your management system to ensure it's still appropriate for what your plans are within the COVID-19 return to work scenario. Do you have any clauses of the relevant ISO standards that were justifiably excluded or limited applicability that were previously limited, or have there been any changes within the scope going forward, or do you plan changes there? You need to consider that. Think about the management system in terms of documentation and information that's contained within it. I'm sure there'll be elements of that that'll need to be reviewed, revised, rewritten based on new working practices, revised risk assessments, etc., etc. So there'll be elements of that that need to be kept refreshed and up to date with the changes. And making those changes is not only a documentation exercise, it's actually a systematic way of making sure you've considered the most relevant things within it. So as you're going through that review of that documentation, it's again, use it like a checklist, right? Oh yeah, we've considered that. Oh, have we captured this? So it isn't just a documentation paper trail, it's an important method for keeping you on track. Within section 5, the leadership section, if the context has changed, then you do have appropriate processes in place to look at the management system to deliver the scope? Do you need to allocate additional resources to the processes or revise the processes? All these things, certainly in smaller organizations, are really dynamic at being able to react to change, and larger organizations are very good at being able to be very specific and changing quite quickly. I think one of the things that's really been demonstrated throughout COVID-19 is the ability of organizations to adapt and change quite rapidly, both large and smaller organizations. Larger organizations may need more formality and have more resources, etc. But the overall adaptiveness and flexibility of organisations has been really positive in terms of being able to change and deliver the needs. Think about roles and responsibilities in terms of COVID-19. Obviously, people will, who's going to do that? How are we going to maintain that? How are we going to monitor that? How are we going to ensure it's effective? Think about all these roles and responsibilities and talk to the people involved. It's really important that you communicate the new roles and responsibilities, and think about how you're going to look at the training and deliver any training that may be required, because it may be a new process, new equipment, new ways of working. You can't expect people to do that without some support and training. So it's also about considering how that training will be delivered. You may have to look at policies and whether policies have changed, and you may have to introduce new or different policies in terms of, how you're going to deal with absenteeism potentially related to COVID-19, sickness, absence, etc. Looking at welfare and supporting policies for employees and staff. If they are involved in COVID-19, they have been involved in a family death or a friend, etc. There's all sorts of emotional and well-being issues that can be brought about by that, and the workforce themselves may need to have clarity on what is the policy in regards, absence and support and various things. So that's down to each organisation based on statutory requirements, but also down to the organisation's own the way it wants to work. So it's down to organisations to define what their policy is in relation to these things, is based on the statutory guidance. And obviously those need to be communicated appropriately to the relevant workforce and interested parties. When we think about planning, have your risks and opportunities been considered? I have no doubt they have, both formally and informally. They may well have changed, and how does your organisation consider to address those going forward? Because there will be significant risk change as we go, and then as various things develop. Like I say, the key is flexibility, keeping your eye, trying to see ahead, think about the future, not just the immediate nature. You need to be flexible. Ensure risks and opportunities are suitably prioritised, so you can't do everything every day. You need to make key decisions on prioritisation. Those that are key must be addressed to return safely to work, and those that are nice to have can probably wait. So, and they can mature, they can be introduced over time. Look at changes made within the organisation and its strategic direction. Has this change altered the organisation's goals, objectives? Any changes must be clearly communicated, and once they've been finalised by top management. So it's about understanding exactly what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it is very important. Also, who has ownership of these goals and objectives? How are they going to be completed? How will success be measured? And how do the responsible parties have all of the information that they need and the resources they need to realise those objectives? It's no point setting an unachievable objective. They need to be measurable and achievable. Business continuity needs to be considered. This could be lessons learned from, let's say, remote working, or that didn't work very well, let's revise that. So it's about this adaptability, and it's about making sure that the business can continue to deliver the services that it needs to, and it is capable of doing throughout, because work is important, and it's important that companies survive, and it's really important both socially and economically for organisations to continue to operate where possible. I know that isn't the case in every scenario, but it really is important about doing your best efforts to make sure that your company is in a place to survive and move forward positively given the challenges of COVID-19. I think one thing's clear globally, that this isn't going to go away very quickly, so it could be with us for some while. So it's looking at the long term and trying to make good decisions based on the information you've got whilst being flexible. You've also got to consider the shutdown itself may have impacted on things like energy usage and energy baselines reviewed for those of you involved in energy management. So all these planning things need to be considered. Are there any new environmental aspects or impacts? Has the significance of existing aspects changed, the frequency, the likelihood, etc.? Does the organisation have any new compliance obligations? A lot of circumstances that is the case, whether they be coming from customers or suppliers or legislative points. A lot of these things are in a state of change and they're rapidly developing. So in a lot of organisations, the compliance obligations are forever changing. So you need a mechanism to keep that within your organisation and to know when changes are happening so that you can implement them appropriately. Has all the new legislation been suitably identified and considered and action taken to ensure compliance? Because obviously, as part of the management systems, all of the management systems, statutory compliance is a fundamental requirement. May include such things as environmental permits and statutory inspections and various things that all need to be considered. If the strategic direction of the business has changed, you may need different permissions or different authorizations to undertake those changes from a regulatory point of view. If goods and services are being supplied internationally, then has the organisation identified the compliance obligations for other countries or the customer base to which it provides them to? Not all countries are the same, and certainly in COVID-19, I think it's fair to say, well, within the UK, we've got different regions and different areas that are applying different controls and different methods, and certainly globally that's the case. So if you're supplying internationally, you really need to have a link in and a method of being able to link into what those requirements are and keeping that suitably refreshed because it's subject to change. And has the organisation suitably risk assessed their own work arrangements, both on-site and for remote working? This is a key element, certainly within the UK, statutory requirements, etc., and government guidance. So it is important that you look at how you're actually going to deliver this working arrangement in a safe and suitable manner, rather than just saying, oh, it'll be all right. Planning and preparation is key to a successful implementation. Have the risk assessments and associated working practices, safe systems of work, etc., been effectively documented, communicated, and deployed appropriately? So depending on the different scale of organisations, etc., that sounds very straightforward, but it can be quite demanding, can put a lot of pressure on administrative resource. What are the arrangements for visitors to site? Think about that. Look at how suppliers and contractors coming onto site would be managed. What needs do they have? I'm thinking of, welfare facilities, etc. What are they going to be allowed to do? How are you going to control the incoming of materials and from suppliers and contractors and service provision? Think about how that's going to work. Be more significant in some organisations than others. And communicating that need and your expectation to that supply chain, to that service provider, is very important. To ensure that the organisation's change management process will be effectively utilising and realise all the necessary changes within the business, ensuring staff and interested parties are made aware of the changes, why they're necessary, not just a matter of you do this and you've got to do it this way because I've told you to. It's better if you engage with them and explain the reasons why. They may come up with some really positive improvements that you can implement. So it's worth that engagement with staff and the workforce generally throughout this, because it's really important that you've got open communications and a good communications culture within your organisation. As I touched on earlier, within the UK, there's various regional differences, shall we say, within the various nations. So, and there's some guidance here applicable to the coronavirus generally, but there's also, we've got links there to the Scottish, Welsh, Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland information points just going forward. Things can be very different depending on where you are regionally within the UK and certainly internationally. So it's important to keep a regular update on these for potential changes. And don't forget to use trade associations and local business and local industry networks to keep abreast of what's happening locally in relation to your sector. General considerations relevant to government guidance. So think about retail, including deliveries and collection services, construction, tradesmen working in domestic homes has also been touched on by the government guidance. Food sector, so there's specific guidance for each one of these. Now, a lot of it is generic. They can't necessarily answer specifically your particular circumstances. So I think that's one of the difficulties of putting out government guidance. They can't always answer specific requirements, but at least it gives you a framework to work within. And there is some good information there, and there is some good guidance in terms of a framework to work within once you're evaluating what needs to be done and how you can do it. So there's also, like I say, from food sector, there's one for manufacturing and processing, some for logistics businesses and outdoor pursuits and etc. Some farming and animal health and welfare, fishing and short-term offshore work. Cargo shipping is also covered by guidance. Transport and logistics businesses are covered, and waste management businesses. Just to reinforce the RIDO reporting requirements for COVID-19 contracted due to occupational activities. If it has been suspected of being contracted due to occupational activities, it is a reportable incident under RIDO. So you need to consider that if that affects you in that way for any of your workers and your workforce. Waste management guidance, obviously the Environment Agency within the UK has done a position statement, and there's various guidance there. Same applies to SEPA in Scotland and Wales, various guidance from all the various agencies, and in Northern Ireland. So look at that, keep up to date. It really is quite important. NQA provide legislative updates and various things which can also help support your activity when it comes to statutory compliance and guidance statements. You've got to think about who will be returning to work. Will it be a phased return? Are we going to have everybody in all at once, or are we going to do it section by section and build it up over time? How does the organisation communicate? Has it got effective channels of communication? If everybody's working remotely, can you still contact them? If you've had staff on furlough, etc., and you're wanting to bring them back, how is all that going to work? This is all about individual needs and requirements. And it really is, don't underestimate communication. Getting communication wrong can cause you all sorts of issues. But it really is important that you think about communication, how it's being delivered, what media it's being delivered over, etc. Some people respond well to text messages, other people don't like them, etc. You know your workforce and your contacts appropriately. Use the most appropriate method based on your own needs and requirements. Does the returning workforce have all the necessary competencies they need for the new working practice conditions? Is additional training required? how you're going to deliver that training if it is needed, what additional resources are needed, how do you going to bring groups together, given certain social distancing restrictions, has documented information been suitably updated and deployed to ensure that people have got reference documents and instructions appropriately to support them in those changes. And how are people going to be made aware of those new documents, etc. So think about this communication process is really important. You've also got to think about the security and physical security arrangements for your organisation. Things change, you know, emergency exits and various things, and how people are going to access and enter the building. How is it going to be controlled? How is it going to be maintained social distancing arrangements, etc. It really has a huge impact on the way you work. PPE provision, things have eased off in that element now. There seems to be a more readily available supply of PPE and hygiene products available, but you've got to make sure they're suitable and sufficient for your needs and how much stock you're going to hold, etc., etc. Think about all that provision, because you will be going through, I would suggest, a higher proportion of PPE and hygiene products than before, due to the potential of increased cleaning and increased use of PPE products. Training we've talked about several times. Like I say, it's really important to keep people and employees on board and the general workforce on board with new arrangements and new measures. Look at regular updates, both direct to staff, to notice boards, electronic notification, websites, whatever it be. Also look at hygiene and welfare arrangements, ensuring it's sufficient. So as you're bringing people back to the workplace, food storage arrangements. So there may have been local provision for canteens or local provision within the organisation or within this organisation's location, but a lot of people are using their own food, and so food storage may be an issue. Think about that. Have you got all the cleaning and facilities and practices in place for sanitising and handrails and door cleaning and frequency? Look at well-being arrangements in terms of dealing with stress and anxiety. Some people want to return to work. Some people are more anxious about returning to work, and think about those that have been impacted by bereavements, family and friends, how that's going to be managed within your organisation, and the impact it can have on people's availability and effectiveness at work. It can be very difficult in some sectors. On the general sort of resources note, do you look to, you may need equipment and devices that needs verifying or calibrating prior to starting up any processes. Is that in place? Can that be achieved? Statutory inspections for the workplace, including lifting equipment and pressure systems, may be required or may have expired during the lockdown period or during the COVID-19 when you've been away from work. They may need to be put into place. It's always worth checking before you restart a process and activities that everything's safe to run, including statutory inspections. So look at the methods of pre-use checks, checking emergency stops, checking guards, etc. In terms of plant and equipment, make sure that just because you left it and it was fine doesn't mean to say that when you come to restart it, it'll be fine. So pre-use checks are really important. You may, when restarting your processes, produce special waste, so there may be some purging materials, etc., within your processes, or different emissions that aren't normal. So how you're going to deal with those. If you're operating under an environmental permit, you may have conditions relating to shutdown conditions, and have they been satisfied? There are some special arrangements in place for storage of waste relating to COVID-19. So you can get information of that on the Environment Agency's website. And regulatory bodies have given some exemptions in the short term for attendance at site to technically competent personnel. So that's something that you may need to be aware of. Exemptions have also been granted for duration and volume of waste being held on site, but these are temporary arrangements And that again is an ever-changing profile within various industries. How and when will processes and products be validated and following startup? So what do you need to validate? How frequently? How is that going to be achieved? Do your customers have any special requirements relating to validation? How will projects that were placed on hold during the shutdown be restarted? Do they need to be restarted? Consider those. That's also think about new arrangements. How will that affect the performance of the manufacturing process or the service provision? Like I say, you may not be bringing all the services back at once. It may be that you're doing a phased return of key processes and building on that. So think about that and the communication, the impact that has on to your customer base and to your suppliers. Are there new requirements? Packaging and labelling, are you up to date? Have international deliveries been affected? So, where you're getting supplied with materials from global sources, lead times have been impacted generally quite significantly in some areas, depending on raw materials and types. Has the outbreak affected the client's supply chain? So, look at, you may need to build in lead times, additional lead times for the business. Materials and products may have been spoiled during shutdown. You may not be able to use them. You may have thought you've got a good stock of, but actually it's perished or whatever during the shutdown. Will post-delivery activities be affected by following the outbreak? You've got to consider how that impacts on your organisation. It'll be very individual. And will the startup of processes generate a load of non-conforming product? How will you manage that? How will you use that? Will it just be a direct waste? Consider that. There are loads of measures and things that you will need to monitor and measure your performance, but are they in place? Think about the internal auditing process and using that to monitor and measure performance of compliance for your new working processes as they're introduced. Has the management review been completed? The senior management suitably engaged with the activity and the needs and requirements of the operations and the various things and the management system requirements? Have all applicable meter readings been taken, applicable for certainly energy and environmental considerations, and the time frame for monitoring and reporting emissions under the various environmental permits? So just make sure you're aware of those as you restart. What we're trying to achieve is business as usual as best we can, and we're looking at going from being good to getting better to being the best. We're looking at making improvements where we can. So it's not about rigidity. It is about control. We do want control, but that doesn't mean to say we can't be flexible and make changes as long as they're planned and implemented effectively. So management systems are not about rigidity. They are about giving control, knowing that you can deliver what's needed from a product and process. It doesn't mean to say they can't change and they can't be developed. And modern management systems are really about that, because they need to meet the needs of the business and the interested parties of that organisation. Quick chat about a new product that NQA have introduced over the COVID-19 pandemic. We can come into organisations at a cost that actually evaluate their COVID secure status verified against particular requirements and guidelines. This can be very useful to support the business and build trust about risk management in the supply chains and wider consumers and stakeholders. It supports the country when returning to work safely. It can help that verification process. It is independent verification, so it isn't just the organisation itself making that declaration. And it can provide assurance to the organisation it's put in place specific measures to mitigate the transmission of COVID-19 in accordance with the government guidelines applicable. So this verifies that an organisation and a site So if an organisation's got multi-site, you could carry out one per site because it is site-specific, not just organisation-specific. So it could only be applied to each particular location that's assessed. But it has particular demonstrable measures, and it can satisfy and give confidence to that sector and to interested parties. It can mitigate and reduce the risk of COVID-19. It can demonstrate the duty of care. It can reassure employees. It can certainly reassure customers, and can be positive commitment and demonstrated PR for the organisation itself. The criteria for verification for the COVID secure NQA's product is based on the government guidelines. So we base all the framework on the specific government guidelines, and we're looking at identification, assessment and control throughout the various processes. And there's generic criteria that apply to every organisation, and then there are sector-specific considerations depending on the organisation's requirements and what sector they are actually working in. Returning to work safely, I think we've covered a huge amount there. It's quite there's quite a lot to think about when we're looking at and considering returning to work safely in mind. A lot of these considerations will be going on continually, both if you've got to a point of returning to work, or if you've already got a partial return to work in place. The process doesn't stop. You're continually thinking about, oh right, what's next? What's changed? What's happening? Commercially, how's it working? Practically, how's it working in terms of protection, etc. How are we going to cope if we have, an outbreak within our work group, etc., etc. All these things are constantly being reviewed and revised within organisations. So there we go. That's the presentation complete, and we'll now open up some questions. So the first question is, can you expand on special arrangements for storage of waste in an office with COVID-19 in mind? So basically, there's been various, I would suggest talk to your local, or go onto your local EA and get some government guidance, because depending on where you're based within the UK, it can vary. But it basically allows you to be able to hold waste on site to stop the transmission. So it's talking about you can hold waste on site, particularly isolating certain types of waste. And I'll say, disposable wipes, nitrile gloves, etc., that have been used that may be COVID contaminated or have the potential to be COVID contaminated. You can isolate them within your workplace and store them on site for a short period of time to reduce the risk of transmission to other third-party handling operations. So that's the basic principle of what's being deployed. But I would say always go and get information, because there's generally the guidance is that you should hold waste for a particular period of number of hours, so that any chance of contamination has been reduced by the duration of holding that in isolation. So that's the principle that's being applied, certainly within the UK. But I would say look at your local arrangements depending on where you are within the UK for that. But that's the type of thing, and it's for like hygiene products, or that type of material that may be generated in reasonable volumes within certain organisations, and may well be needed to be held on site for a period of time prior to being released into the waste disposal stream. Hopefully that answers that question. Has anybody got any more questions specific on generally the presentation that I can try and answer, or any other concerns? Like I say, the presentation has been recorded. The slides will be sent out to you. There's just try and be systematic in your approach Try and use your management system to help you. It's not there to hinder you. It really is there as a structure to use, and be flexible to deliver those benefits going forward. Don't see it as a restrictive practice or operation. And yes, things can be done quickly, but things can also need to be done well, especially in this COVID-19 scenario. So it's important that we get as much right as we can, and where we can get better, use the system to make those improvements and identify the changes that are needed. But keep the communication channels open, keep in touch with people, communicate effectively, and stay safe and well in your efforts to return to work, but fundamentally stay safe. So thank you all very much. If there's no more questions, I don't think there is that I can see. So thank you everybody for your attendance. Like I say, I know there's been a lot to take on, but don't let it panic you. Use the system, be systematic, keep in control, and don't be overwhelmed by it. We can do this, and we can do it very well. So stay safe. Thank you all very much.